Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we have the final few cards revealed from the Pokemon 151 set in Japan. It's being released on June 16th over there. It's probably not going to hit our shelves until late August, early September, so this won't be impacting the World Championships. This will be coming out afterwards, but this is still mostly a collector set. As you can see, throwbacks to previous artworks from the base set, and as you can imagine, 151 means we're doing the Gen 1 Pokedex here. So a lot of great artwork, a lot of great fanfare going on, a lot of good throwback. Not necessarily the most competitive cards that we're going to be looking at today, but there are still some highlights as I'm going to zoom my way down to the trainers first, as I always like to start things off. One interesting tidbit is that the set is in Pokedex order, so we're not going to go via type, it's via Pokedex here, which should make for a pretty decent binder, at least for collectors. Let's get into the trainers first then, and we start off with Energy Sticker. Flip a coin. If heads, attach a basic energy from your discard pile to one of your benched Pokemon. This is very similar to the old Turbo patch that we used to have, but this doesn't have any text about GXs. I think that's why it wasn't a reprint. This is actually a downgrade, I believe, because this has to be to a benched Pokemon, which is even worse and more convoluted to get working. So actually being worse than Turbo patch means that I think this will basically never see play. We have the Snatch Arm Trainer, which looks at your opponent's hand. Then you choose a Pokemon you find there and put it to the bottom of your opponent's deck. A little bit of disruption, can be frustrating at times. I think there can be some handlock combos starting to come together when we have the likes of Roxanne and Iono, and then you have Snatch Arm, and then it only takes like an attack that gets rid of two random cards from your opponent's hand, and suddenly they have no hand at all, which I think is fairly interesting. But because we are in an Iono format, there's going to be a lot of on-board like draw a lot of the time, so that's going to be something that handlock decks have to sort of work around. This is obviously not disruptive enough or good enough to put into a conventional deck. Just having to look at your opponent's hand effects may be useful for a supporter that we look at momentarily, or a couple even, but I don't feel like it's going to be worth a slot in conventional decks. We have an old Helix Fossil, which is a item card that you treat as a 60 hit point colorless basic, and at any time during a turn you can discard this from play. It can't retreat and can't be affected by status conditions. Its ability is Sea Swell. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, your opponent can't play any stadium cards from their hand. Actually kind of interesting if you want to try and make some random like lock of path in play, and then you can have this to stop the opponent from playing stadiums. We already have this effect from a Celebrations Palkia, and it's seen like no play, even though I've tried it in a couple of things over the months. But no, I feel like this is pretty poor. We'll obviously get to see the evolutions later, but as we know, fossils inherently are just so bad because we have such poor item search in comparison to Pokemon search, so inherently these cards are really, really weak. We have the Dome Fossil, which has the same text as the Helix, all but for the ability, which is now this Pokemon takes 30 less damage from attacks. It's fine, it's a 90 hit point basic essentially. And then we have the old Amber, which again shares the same text as the other two, but then has the ability prevent all effects of your opponent's Pokemon's abilities done to this Pokemon, so I guess it can't be pinged down or stuff like that, which I guess is a thing, but again, really not that relevant. But Aerodactyl may be one of the more promising fossils that we'll look at today, so something to bear in mind. We move on to a few tools then. The Safety Goggles interacts with basic Pokemon and says that they have no weakness. There really aren't that many chunky basics out there. Typically the basic Pokemon are the ones that are the squishiest and the easiest to knock out even without weakness. But maybe if you can try and like buff up Pokemon with like abilities rather than tools or something, you can make something large and then have the requirement for weakness removal. But I feel like this card is in general really weak and sort of goes against what the identity of basics are, in that they're kind of the glass cannons, right? We then have the Big Balloon, which gives Stage 2 Pokemon no retreat cost. I also think this is also quite poor. Typically, if you want switch cards in your deck, you want them to be able to be used in the opening turns of the game as well, and obviously inherently Stage 2s can't do that, so this card doesn't get online until you're set up in the game, and oftentimes if you have Stage 2s in play, they're high priority targets for your opponent to deal with, so it means the balloon is also going down. So I think it's also quite poor. The Rigid Band is probably the most promising of the tools that we're going to look at today. Stage 1 Pokemon this card is attached to take 30 less damage from your opponent's Pokemon. Pretty nice, a decent reduction. Obviously, this can't work on V-Star Pokemon or V-Max Pokemon, bear that in mind, because it states Stage 1, not Evolved Pokemon. So it has to be on, like, EXs, but we are getting some fairly chunky EX Pokemon, so it's not unrealistic to expect adding a Rigid Band puts you out of one-hit KO range of a ton of different stuff. So kind of the most interesting one, I think, here. Usually reduction is worse than buff, but sometimes we are going to have some tanking decks out there, and the Rigid Band is going to be solid for that. We then have a reprint, an upgrade, actually, of Leftovers. Leftovers from many years back now. I think it was Diamond and Pearl era when it first came out. May have been even earlier than that. But at the end of your turn, you heal 20 from the Pokemon this card is attached to. Big buff where it used to be 10. But this card is terrible text, but because it's the keyword Leftovers, it interacts with Snorlax that's in the set, so it may see play just because of that, because essentially this is a recoverable tool card, which will have a look at a combination of cards in this set that work alongside this. That means that maybe this sees play. The only upside, I think, specifically for this like Electrode Snorlax deck, which is essentially like a tool drop style deck, I suppose, is that because you have lower hit point Pokemon around your board, you could attach your Leftovers to things that you could then like heal after your opponent's maybe Sableye Sprinkled, taking a KO and put damage on excess things. The Leftovers could like undo that bit of work, which I think is the only like relevant part of it being the card outside of just its name. Leftovers is the thing that's interacting with Snorlax. We then have some interesting supporters. Erica's Invitation, really interesting supporter card, actually. Your opponent reveals their hand, choose a basic Pokemon you find there and put it onto their bench, and then switch it to the active position. This is like one of the biggest high roll supporters we've seen in a long time. Obviously, the card is probably way too risky to ever attempt to put into most generic decks. But if we have some hand tutoring, or hand scouting, I should say, for the opponent side of things, we can try and time this effectively to really punish the opponent. We have seen things like the Manaphy in recent block Snorlax decks where you're forcing things onto the bench. This does that and immediately puts them into the active position, which is a massive effect. And there are the likes of Squawkabilly EX, there are the likes of Luminion V hanging around decks, and I think those are the cards you're most often trying to catch, right? If we can force these Pokemon, even from like the discard pile into the opponent's hand, then Erica's them into the active position. That's obviously a great way for us to take easy prize cards. So I feel like it's not going to see play just in, again, conventional decks, just because we have now the cornerstones of Boss Iono Research. Those are such powerful cards that it's really hard to squeeze any supporters into decks. But if we have very specific denial control strategies, this could easily see some play. Or if we can construct a deck that has good supporter tutor for when this card is helpful, and have hand scouting, so that we are not just completely whiffing our supporter for the turn, this could see a little bit of play. We then have Giovanni's Charisma, another really interesting card, actually. Put an energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon into their hand, and if you do, you can attach an energy from your hand to your active Pokemon. So it's a 2 energy swing. I feel like this is still a little bit weak. I like that it is some disruption on the opponent's side of the field. So I feel this could be really, again, opening the doors up for some controlling style strategies where there could possibly be some annoying attacks that you could be using as a control deck that are just too expensive to use. But now having Giovanni's Charisma means you could get the attachment in on your guy whilst removing an attachment from the opponent's, and then you could like get your turn attachment in on your annoying attacker and then do that effect, whatever it is. I think you have to bear in mind that, again, most of the time you want to be knocking out your opponent's active Pokemon, so it doesn't matter that they're losing their energy from hand if you're scoring that knockout. So I feel like this, again, tends towards a control style deck where it's that -1 energy attachment plus you're getting that extra bit of value. So that maybe you could access, again, more interesting attacks on your own end that are just too expensive to conventionally use. Also, it's just an energy, which is nice, so you could even be attaching special energy. So pretty awesome actually. Really interesting card. Again, I feel like the -1 energy attachment isn't good enough in normal decks, but there could be some windows opened because of the swing of energy. Mostly the part where you get to accelerate your own end whilst also disrupting the opponent. It's like a big combination that could open the door for previously like awkward attackers that just don't quite do enough. We then have Daisy's Help. It's a supporter that allows you to draw 2, then look at your face-down prize cards. It's an upgrade to Island Hermit. Those cube players will know about that. It's still a really poor effect. It won't make it in Standard, but a nice cube upgrade. Happy to see it. We then have Bill's Teleport. Look at the top 8 cards of your deck. You may reveal any number of Pokemon you find there and put them into your hand, then shuffle the other cards back into your deck. It's a big poker radar from the Diamond and Pearl era, but in a supporter effect. It's random. Just looking at top 8 isn't enough value to look at your Pokemon. We actually have insane ball search in the game right now, so we definitely don't need an effect like this on a supporter. And again, those Cornerstones, Iono Boss research, they're way too good. They are absolutely broken cards, so these sorts of things will never get a look in. We then have Cycling Road. It allows you, once during each player's turn, to discard an energy from their hand. If they do, that player draws 1. So you're just literally cycling a card from your deck. Pretty reasonable value, actually. I think, you know, we've seen how good Radiant Greninja is. That's obviously plussing, and you get to see double the amount of cards, so it's massive. And I suppose you're spending a card into the Cycling Road the first time you play it, so you're actually minusing 1 from hand to be able to use the combination of Cycling Road, but you are seeing an additional card. And as always, we know there are oftentimes synergies with energy in the discard pile, especially with Superior Energy Retrieval coming back. Could be an interesting card. I don't feel like this is like that strong, but it could be just like a just good enough stadium bounce for the likes of Guardy, for a few other decks out there where they have that discard synergy inbuilt, and it's that path bounce that you're looking for. So I feel like it's pretty okay. Nothing blowing me away, but it could end up being like just good enough upside over other stadiums in the game right now. As I'm going to try and skip all the way back up to the top, and of course we're starting with number 1 in the Pokedex, Bulbasaur. A lot of these aren't all that interesting, to be honest with you. I've already mentioned this is mostly a collector-based set, but here we go. We'll start with Venusaur EX. 340 hit points on a 2-prize Pokemon is huge, and it does have the Soothing Bloom ability. Once during a turn, if this Pokemon is in your active spot, you may heal 60 from one of your Pokemon. It has a very hefty 4 retreat cost, which makes its own ability quite limiting. And it means that probably you need this to be the thing that you're healing a lot of the time. But maybe you push yourself out of 2-hit KO range if you are up against lower damage output decks. We have the Potent Whip that does 150, and your opponent's active is now poisoned and confused. It is annoying to confuse the opponents. Obviously, its attack cost is quite expensive, and its damage output is also fairly low. So it's too awkward to get a stage 2 into play and constantly get it in and out of the active position, even with the new balloon, of course. To get that mini heal of 60, it's like not that big of a deal. So it's not going to be played just for its ability, and its attack isn't, you know, easy enough to power up to chain, really. So, yeah, unfortunate for Venusaur. We then have Charizard EX. 330 hit points, still pretty massive. Has a 2 retreat cost and 2 attacks. The first, for just 1 fire, is Resolute Wings. You do 60, and if this Pokemon has any damage counters on it, it does 100 more damage. 160 for 1, very efficient. It does have to combine most likely with Magma Basin to get working, but that's absolutely fine because you want to be playing Basin in your fire decks anyway. It probably is, again, quite combo reliant, quite convoluted to actually get that sort of turn 2 Resolute Wings, even though it is just a 1 energy attack, because you need to get your stadium, you need to candy a benched Charmander into a Charizard, then do the Basin thing, then get it into the active position. So there are a lot of steps to actually get that cheap attack going. But in the mid game, this can just be a thing that sort of keeps you going, especially knocking through like 1-prize Pokemon quite easily. And then you have the devastating Vortex attack for 4 fire energy. You deal 330 and discard 3 energy from this Pokemon. So the raw stats on this Charizard are really good. You have an excellent attack to get through 1-prize decks with just a 1 energy attack cost, and you have an excellent attack at getting through multi-prize decks with an expensive attack, yes, but the damage output that we're looking for. 330 is such a great number that we're always trying to deal, and the discard of 3 energy is expensive, but we do have acceleration from fire, and of course we have the Pokemon Go Charizard, which can double each fire energy attached, right? So each fire now costs 2 fire, so effectively we're doing 330 for 2 energy. That's big upside, and I think this will be a very clunky deck, but the selling points are here, right? We can deal with one prizes, we can deal with multi-prizes very effectively. It's just how quickly can we get those Charizards online. We're having to play a split of our evolution lines. We're having to play multiple Basin to try and get that first attack rolling quite effectively. So it's going to be a tight, crammed-in deck, and it's going to be probably low on the consistency side, but there are actual selling points to this. I feel like it could see a decent amount of play if we're heading down that direction of being multi-prizes, where you get given that time to set up a little bit more. I feel like that's a decent option. Blastoise EX is also really cool and really big, 330 hit points, but also has the Solid Shell reducing 30 damage from attacks. Absolutely monster Pokemon. It has the Twin Cannons attack for 2 water. You discard up to 2 basic water from your hand, and this attack has 140 for each you discarded in this way. So 280 is another great breakpoint that we're looking for. We've seen from Giratina V-Star that just by hitting 280 you immediately become like viable and definitely worth considering. Even more so because it's a Blastoise, which is an EX, rather than Tina, which can get shut off by V-Guard energy by certain other V-Star decks. So just a card that can deal that very efficient damage output seems really good. My initial thought was that Blastoise was going to go possibly as a 101 line into like Chien-Pao Baxcalibur decks. But the more I've played with Chien-Pao Baxcalibur, the more I've realized it's really hard to A, have bench space for that sort of thing, and B, like, a lot of the time we're seeing a mix and match of Palkia and Baxcalibur, so it's like a thin Bax line with possibly even as low as 2 rare candy. So fitting in the Blastoise is not that easy. But what I do think is that you could just see a Blastoise plus Palkia V-Star style deck and still have that big barrel in there, where this Blastoise can access that sort of higher damage output threshold, and you have that time to still Irida Candy, but you have that early pressure of Palkia V-Star. And I think that has a lot of merits to it, right? So you can use your Star Portal to help power up the Blastoise, then you can still have Superior Energy Retrieval in the deck, just so that you can make sure you're still swinging with Twin Cannons turn by turn, and just by having Superiors in the deck, you naturally make the big barrel stronger as well. So I feel like this card has just got such good stats, it probably will see play, but I probably think it won't go alongside Baxcalibur Chien-Pao. I think it's more likely to just be its own deck with Palkia Bibarel. But I think it's powerful. It could even just be as low as like a 202 line, but gives that Palkia deck that sort of burst potential that we've been lacking for a little bit right now, because Ice Rider's not really getting the job done too much anymore. So I think Blastoise is probably the most promising of the Stage 2s so far. I am going to have to skip through a number of these cards, but there will be some artwork appreciation in there. Honestly, the full set just has insane artwork like throughout. The Beedrill is pretty interesting. It's a Grass-type Stage 2 with 130 hit points. It has the Adverse Stinger attack. For 2 colors, you deal 30. If you don't have any cards in hand, this attack does 120 more damage, and your opponent's active is now poisoned and paralyzed. Always have to feel that buzzword of paralysis automatically. Is always something that you have to respect, especially in a format where we can reduce our opponent's hand size down and make it more difficult for them to find their outs. The one awkward thing here is, though, that you have to reduce your hand size to 0. We have seen how things like Gramble and things like, even in more recent times, Hisuian and Arcanine can function and can get their hand size quite low and use their attacks, and even use the Radiant Venusaur to like top yourself up for the following turn to like try and chain those attacks. But on a Stage 2, it just becomes even more awkward. You have even more floating pieces that you possibly can't discard too easily. And the problem is, with like Gramble and Arcanine, you're trying to just power through the opponent, right? You're trying to get, win the game in probably between like 5 and 6 attacks. You're trying to win the game with the Gramble and Arcanine. Whereas Beedrill, you're intentionally trying to extend the game for as long as possible. So it's really hard to continually like either draw your top deck and insta-play it. It's really hard to like make a deck that has insta-plays the whole time, or have a combination of cards that can constantly get you down to 0 cards in hand. This is the thing that's really difficult to get right when you're trying to constantly chain that paralysis. So I think that's something that we have to bear in mind. It won't always be online. The good news is, right, if the opponent is paralyzed and is like stuck in that lock, it means that you don't need to at least constantly reload your B the next turn. So there's at least that going for you, but otherwise I think it's probably going to be too hard to get rolling. The Pidgey's cool. It has a search for 2 basic Pokemon, so that's a big upgrade for cube lovers. That's awesome. The Erraticate can do 30. Sorry, yeah, 30 plus 30 more for each damage counter on your opponent's active Pokemon. So maybe you could do some wonky setup, either abilities or spread of counters, and then Eradicate can be that sort of finisher for just a double colorless energy. But I feel like it's not really worth putting into a deck, especially something so squishy. Nothing too interesting on a lot of this other stuff. We have an Arbok EX, 270 hit point dark type with the bind down attack for 2 dark, you do 70, and during your opponent's next turn the defending Pokemon can't retreat. And the menacing fangs for triple dark does 150, and your opponent discards 2 cards from their hand. Like I was saying, with Iono and with that weird arm thing, you can make some hand destruction style combos in here. A 3 dark energy attack cost is awkward. Yes, we have patch in format, but even then it's still quite difficult to get rolling, and 150 damage is still very, very low. So this probably needs some damage modification buff, and yeah, its attack cost is probably going to be its biggest limiting factor from being a card. I absolutely adore this Raichu because it's going into my cube and it looks awesome, so that's great. We have a Sandshrew, which is a really random card that we're getting that just randomly trolls Sander at times, I suppose. The ability is Hide in Sand. Trainer cards in your opponent's discard pile can't be returned to the deck by the effect of opponent's item or supporter cards. So this can disrupt some infinite loop style combos. So could be an interesting card, I suppose. Could be a tech inclusion if we are worried about some infinite loops that could end up seeing play at different points. The Sandslash, not too interesting though. We have Anita Queen. Not too great. It can prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by the attacks from basic Pokemon. So possibly this is a backup attacker, because we will look at the Neato King in a moment. And just having inbuilt blocking from basics, I suppose, is relevant to that archetype. But the reason you might want to get some Neato Queens into play is because Neato King has the King's Vigor ability, stating that if you have a Neato Queen on your bench, this Pokemon's attacks cost 0 energy. So it can be swinging for 190 for 0, and your opponent's active is now poison, so essentially 200. We can try and push that with Radiant Sneasler, of course, Hisuian Sneasler. So it's actually hitting a really solid number for a single prize Pokemon. It's just a lot of setup, right? You need to get multiple stage 2s online, even when you have so much more space in your deck, essentially, if you choose to play no energy and don't even have the option of the Neato Queen attack. Yes, you get a lot of space, but even then, it's like there's only a finite amount of consistency, especially for evolution Pokemon that we could be playing. Like, you'd end up having to play random cards like Capturing Aroma, which never feels that good. You need to have multiple stage 2s developed throughout the game, which is never that easy. So it's still going to be this clunky card. It's funny that it's a dark type, which makes it possibly a little bit more relevant. So it is annoying for Guardy players. It is annoying for Mew players that it just happens to be in that mix. And its damage output is really good. So there's going to be meme variations of this. I just don't feel like it's still a real deck. Because yeah, you have to devote so many resources to playing multiple stage 2 lines, and then also find a way to like cycle through your deck, and that just ends up filling up a lot of your board space and all this other stuff, because you always need your King in the active, at least a Nidoran male on the bench. You'll need at least a Neato Queen of developed and another Nidoran female on the bench. So it's just a lot of work throughout the game to keep maintained. We have a Ninetales EX, 260 hit point fire type that has Heat Wave. 13, your opponent's active Pokemon is now burned, and then the Mirrored Flames for fire colorless does 80. If you have the same number of cards in hand as your opponent, you do 140 more damage. It's a decent prod, but again, not blowing me away at all. Yeah, it's easy enough to match hand sizes, I suppose, but it's not a big enough upside for the work. We have Jigglypuff, which searches for a supporter and puts it into the hand. Only mentioning this because it is going to be evolving into Wigglytuff EX, which is a 250 hit point colorless stage 1 Pokemon, which is normally on the low side, but it does have the expanding body ability. If this Pokemon has any special energy attached, it gains 100 hit points, and you probably will want special energy because the attack cost is all colorless, so why not? We have the Friend Tackle for 3 colorless. You deal 90 damage, and if you played a supporter card from your hand during this turn, 90 more damage. So similar attack text to Mega Ordino, actually, as you get to do more if you played a supporter each turn. So the idea is, especially because we already have the Wigglytuff from Paldea Evolved, the one that can attach therapy energy from hand to one of your Pokemon, the idea is you can power this up with double turbos, therapy energies, and I suppose a handful of other special energies can make their way into the deck, like jets and whatnot. And you're going to have this very large and in charge boy, I suppose. 190, really poor damage output, and there are times when you don't want to play supporter and you have to constantly have a steady flow of these, so you need to weight your deck to probably play like 14 supporters at least, which is something that you don't always like to do, so you don't really have as much space as you'd like. Plus, to be this big, coming from an ability, it's not great, right? Because it means you're keeping Gardevoir's ability online all game, and you're keeping Chien-Pao's abilities online all game, so normally if we want to see tanking decks, a lot of the time it comes alongside things like Path, so you can not get blown away by the one-hit KO decks of the format, and unfortunately, because this is an ability, you will have to allow them to have those abilities. Now, Wigglytuff could still see play, depending on what's like relevant in the meta. I can't see Gully going anywhere, though, so I think it's still going to be like a glamorous, but ultimately quite bad deck, where the damage output's just not there, and there will be enough things that can either turn off this ability because Path is still everywhere, or because you can't play Path yourself, you'll just get bodied by the one-hit KO decks in format. Zubat, very interesting. Once during your turn, if this is in the active spot, you may use this ability, your opponent reveals their hand. Definitely good to get information from the opponent's hand. This could be good for the Erica supporter that we were talking about earlier. This could be good for controlling decks, just to see, before using the likes of Sydney or other annoying supporter effects. So that's definitely one to keep in mind, especially because the entire line is good, right? We have the Zubat that can give you that scouting, but then you can evolve into the drawing Golbat and the drawing Crobat, so maybe that starts becoming a line in decks, just because every aspect of the card is now pretty helpful. We then have Gloom and Vileplume. The Gloom allows you, when you evolve, to look at the top 3 cards and attach any number of basic energy you find there to your Pokemon in any way that you like. So a bit of a high roll, but we do have a few cards that can try and manipulate the top of our deck, I suppose, to see if we can get basic energy on there. So it can be a burst of energy, which I suppose is pretty nice. And the Vileplume is the same effect, but now we're looking at the top 8 rather than the top 3. So a little bit more reliable, I suppose. We do have a Klinklang, which has a guaranteed attach of 3 in format that's seen absolutely no play. So that makes me feel this won't, because the minor upside of Gloom high rolling isn't like that's worthwhile, I don't think. We have Parasect, which flips 2 coins for each head, search your deck for a grass Pokemon and put it onto your bench, then shuffle your deck. Could be a way to try and get some Meowscaradas into play, but probably terrible. Venomoth has the Distraction Powder attack, deals 30. Your opponent's active is now confused, and they also can't play items from their hands, so a very annoying effect, actually. This is kind of cool. We need buffs on these low damage output item lock style cards. We've seen that Banette's not quite good enough right now. Adding in that confusion definitely is helpful, right? Because you can make life more difficult for the opponents without their easy ways to rope and switch out of the actives. So that's at least something. I feel like this is an interesting enough card. Levelable, searchable, easily recoverable, that sort of thing. But it is still that low damage output, which is always going to be the concern. We have... look at them. Look at the boys. Okay. We have a Persian, which can search your deck for that Giovanni's Charisma card. So if we are making a control deck, maybe this is a line, but probably not, to be honest. We can keep scrolling our way down, because there's a lot of bulk in here. Nothing looking too great. Okay, so we have the Alakazam line, and we finally see Cadabra back after 20 years. Everyone's already heard this line before, but yeah, the Yuri Geller story. Pokemon weren't able to print Cadabras for the longest time. Now they're back, and I think that's part of the reason why they can finally make this 151 set. I'm certain that on the 25th anniversary they probably would have tried to do this were it not for their injunction, I suppose, but now they can. So good to see you back, Cadabra. Hopefully we see many more of you, because a lot of people love the Alakazam line. And Alakazam actually has been treated well with a very interesting card. It's a psychic type with 310 hit points, weak to dark, resistance to fighting, and just that 1 retreat cost. It has 2 attacks. The first for 2 colorless is Mind Jack. You deal 90 and 30 more for each of your opponent's bench Pokemon. Decent enough attack, to be honest with you, keeping the opponent in check. There's a lot of setup-based decks that have to go wide, can't really put less than 4 things into play, so you're naturally getting pretty good damage output there. But you also have the Dimension Manipulation attack for 2 Psychic. You deal 120, and this Pokemon can use this attack even when it's on the bench. We haven't seen attack text like this before. Think of it like hit and run, but you don't have to have the extra steps. You don't need to move your Pokemon in and out of the active position, so you can just leave your big chunky wall there, whilst the Alakazam is just sort of still safely on the bench, and saves you space from having to play just a ton of extra switching cards on top. I really like hit and run style strategies. We have some annoying Pokemon. We have Mimikyu, we have Klefki, we have Ting-Lu even, so a lot of annoying Pokemon that we can be leaving in the active position. That 120 is really low damage output, so I foresee this being like that sort of early game attack option whilst you're like getting into the game and trying to slow down the opponent with annoying walls, and then you probably still need to move into Mind Jack as that sort of later game push if you are into multi-prize matchups. Overall though, I like the card. It has a good combination of high damage output here as well as like mid damage output disruption, which you can use against like the 1 prize decks. Like I was saying with Charizard, it's always nice to have a card that can play both, because we're really in a format where there's going to be a ton of 2 prize decks and 1 prize decks, and then a lot of those decks are a mixture of both. So it's really important to have cards that can do the little prods and have upside, as well as have the higher damage output at its disposal, which Mind Jack doesn't get that high, but it is still at least pretty handy. And we know that Psychic has a lot of support around it, so I can foresee this Alakazam seeing some play. Definitely an interesting card. Not like mind-blowing, but does probably just enough to see some play, I think. We have a Machamp. If it would be knocked out, flip a coin. If heads, it's not. It has 10 hit points remaining instead. And its Melting Chop does 100 and discards the top 2 cards of the opponent's deck. Could be funny if you just randomly keep flipping heads. You can continually mill the opponent. Great fun. That's a YouTube video waiting to happen. Let's see what else. We got Golem EX, 330 hit points, fighting type, stage 2. Has the dynamic roll 50 and 120 more during your opponent takes 150 more next turn, then 180. Yeah, it's absolutely terrible. Unfortunate Golem. It's been a while since you've had some, alt. What am I trying to say? Higher rarity, but even then you're still getting trolled, which sucks. We have, look at this. Oh, absolute genius. Right. The Magneton, though, does have an interesting attack. Put 2 items from your discard pile into your hand. Control Zorobox. Let's go. We get Junk Hunt back. Could be a thing. We have a Dodrio as well, which is kind of interesting. A 100 hit point stage 1 Pokemon, colorless, that has the Rampage Draw ability. You must put a... Oh, sorry. Yeah, to be able to use the ability, you must put a damage counter on, but that's kind of the upside. But once during a turn, you can draw a card. So plonk a counter on, draw a card is the idea. And the reason why we like this is it has the attack Raging Beaks that does 10 plus 30 more for each damage counter on this Pokemon. Pretty cool, actually. It's reminiscent of Spiritomb, of course. That actually ended up seeing some play. Now, this probably needs some support around it to sort of speed up the process, because it takes too long to just rely on a ton of Rampage draws each turn and like passing or using other like early game attacks. But this could be still worked in, because you can reach that higher damage output threshold, which I think is pretty good. So there could be a selling point of this card being a high damage output single prizer, obviously limited by the worries of Lost Zone Box and stuff like that, but maybe you could have a workaround. Just because this is a colorless Pokemon with just a 1 colorless in its attack cost, you get to play Gift Energy, you get to play a ton of other special energy, which could be really handy. So I think Dodrio's like really not bad. It could either be like a thin line in a deck that requires some single prize beat stick potential, or it could be its own deck and then needs to work in a way of dealing with Lost Zone Box. One of those two things could certainly happen. I think this has a lot of potential. One of my favorite cards from the set, actually, in terms of intrigue and trying to construct decks around it. There are ways that you can, I should have mentioned, there are ways that you can try and damage this card a lot quicker with like different stadiums and whatnot. You could try and use like Stadium Baxcalibur to throw a ton of damage and a ton of energy onto the Dodrio all in one go, and then you can just start swinging with the Raging Beaks. There's a few other ways you can try and damage yourself, like Gapejaw Bog and this, that, and the other. I won't go into the full thing, but yeah, there are ways that we can speed up that process, I suppose. Nothing else too interesting. We do have a Gengar line, the Haunter. When you evolve, you can choose a supporter from your opponent's discard pile and put it into their hand. The idea is that you have the Poltergeist attack on your Gengar that does a 50x the amount of trainers you find there, so similar to Gengar Mimi. But this is a stage 2, so yeah, still quite bad. Onyx is going to go into my Chaos Cube because it's an upgrade on the Steelix line. You'll love to see that. Hypno can sleep when it evolves, sleep the opponent's active. We then have the Electrode, which is one of the more interesting cards of the sets. It's a stage 1 lightning type with 90 hit points. Has the Boom Boom Chain attack for 1 lightning. You deal 20 plus 40 more for each tool that you discard from your Pokemon. And like I said, we have leftovers, and we will be looking at Snorlax, which allows you to recover 2 leftovers, essentially. So the idea will be have Electrode active, Voltorb bench, double Snorlax, and then do the rest what you will with your board is the idea, and then you can have some higher damage output. Being a lightning type is very good. We know that Palkia is going to be around. We know that Lugia is going to be around, so at least sort of checking those boxes is always nice. 90 hit points is a pretty good number for a stage 1, so you have level ball searchability, and you have Rescue Kara recovery. Yeah, that's the one. I randomly thought that I got it wrong there. But yeah, 20 plus the 40 more means that with the 4 leftovers being binned each turn, you're at least dealing 180, and that's before you start throwing your other 2 tools into the bin turn by turn. So the deck doesn't necessarily need to have that stupid amount of like 20 tools just to do something, but it could if you want it to. It could also go alongside things like Rotom V and V Star. This could be like your early game way of getting tools into the bin, and then you can start like loss owning them with Rotom as well later. So I think there are avenues for Electrode to be this like rogue single prize deck, I suppose, is the idea. Still finding those leftovers in the first place is going to be tricky, and you probably will still have to have a weird deck composition to actually make it work, but it's interesting, I guess. Cubone buffs the damage of Marowak, but Marowak isn't anything to write home about, unfortunately. Hitmonlee, a few people are hyped about this card. I really don't understand why. 120 hit point basic, has the Tornado Kick that does 10 to each of your opponent's Pokemon. You switch into a different bench Pokemon. People are thinking this is a crazy busted combo with Ting-Lu, where you like catch the whole bench and disrupt them. But all of your energy in the Ting-Lu deck need to go onto Ting-Lu's. So, honestly, spending a turn attachment is so bad in Ting-Lu on anything but Ting-Lu. You'll come to know that as you play the deck. So I think it probably doesn't even make it into the Ting-Lu archetype, I'll be honest with you. Maybe it does, but it certainly might not be good enough in the Ting-Lu deck. Also because bench space is so premium in Ting-Lu. You basically always go Koraidon, Squawk, Ting, Ting, and you almost always need Zam or Hawlucha. I suppose Hitmonlee takes the slots of the Hawlucha, but you also then need to like cram your deck with probably more than the 4 switch outs that you're currently playing and all this other stuff that the Hitmonlee doesn't come off that often, so it's probably quite bad actually. Hitmonchan's not doing anything, Lickitung's not doing anything. The Weezing could be another combination card for our Alakazam, because it has the Explode Together ability. If this Pokemon's in the active and is knocked out, flip a coin. If heads, the attacking Pokemon is knocked out. Let's go. Oh boy, scary text. Really, really scary text. Its attack is terrible, so you always have to think of this as a hit and run style card. So this could be, it could be Weezing Zam as the combo, where we're just blowing up anything that is hitting into us on that coin flip. Could be a fun troll deck for sure. What else we got going on here? Speaking of trolling, we have Chansey. Its ability is Lucky Bonus. If you took this Pokemon as a face-down prize card and your bench isn't full, you may put this into your hand. Oh, it should be onto the bench, right? Oh, yeah, sorry. And sorry, before you put it into your hand, you may put it onto the bench. Flip a coin if heads. Take 1 more prize card. So it's a downgrade on greedy dice. So because you need to commit bench space to this card. But we do have ways to manipulate our prize cards. We can try and shove Chanseys in there. And I suppose if we play enough of them and have enough coin flips and whatnot, maybe if we have ways of clearing our board for multiple attempts of the lucky bonus, we can go for it. But yeah, this is a downgrade on greedy dice. We then have a Kangaskhan, really not doing too much. It draws 3 and then flips coins for damage. What else we got going on? Starmie's actually kind of interesting. A 90 hit point, stage 1. Once during a turn, you may put 2 counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. If you place damage counters in this way, discard this Pokemon and all cards attached. So people will, of course, remember Flapple, which never really saw that much play, but people experimented and tried with it in all sorts of different builds. Starmie, I feel like, will have a similar life cycle. The good news is it's levelable, searchable, and rescue carrier recoverable, which I think is obviously a big part of the card because it's all constantly discarding itself. The one thing I will note is that Guardy, of course, very often will damage its Shining Arcana Guardy to the point of only having 20 hit points remaining. So this could end up being a tech card for Guardy EX players. If you are playing higher hit point Pokemon like V-Stars or high hit point EX Pokemon, even the Zacian can put itself into range of getting KO'd back. So the Starmie could end up being a tech card to allow you to take multi-prize turns on, like, deal with Shining Arcana on the turn and then attack through something else on that turn as well. So actually a decent tech card and could be keeping Guardy in check, which is something to bear in mind. Of course, it has to go alongside an archetype that has high enough hit points to make them damage themselves a bunch. So it's not going to be like a universal tech card. It's not going to be that easy way to counter Guardy now. It might be a very specific deck where this comes off, but could be good for that. And I suppose it is universal damage buff as well, I suppose, if we are trying to really be generous about this card. Mr. Mime has Mimic Barrier. If this Pokemon and your opponent's active with the same number of energy attacks, prevent all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks from your opponent's active. It's really not that good text. When we have Lugia, when we have Chempa, when we have Guardy, they can all go silly with their energy attack cost at any different point and burst their way through this Mr. Mime. It has a Psi Power attack that places 3 counters on your opponent's Pokemon in any way you like, but yeah, really not that big a deal. It could be a 1-card counter to the Neato King deck. Oh, you hate to see it. Okay. A Jinx can knock out things that are sleeping. Not great, though. It's too much setup, too much work. We have a Gyarados, a 190 hit point stage 1 Pokemon with the Ruffian ability. When you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during your turn, you must discard the top 5 cards from your deck. You love to see it. So this can be a way to do some weird combos if you want to get to the bottom of your deck. It's helpful, right? It's helping you get there. Let's play Pokestop Gyarados and just yeet to the bottom. If we have an infinite loop, it could be a thing. There's also, what's it called? The Hisuian Basculin, I want to say, that can deal more damage based on the amount of energy in your bin, and then you like shuffle them back into the deck. So we could do that and then do, like, again, a ton of Gyarados all in one turn and then just have another big burst of damage. Maybe some wonky combos with this card. In general, it's pretty poor though, but fun, like, text. We have a Ditto, which is kind of interesting. The Transforming Starts ability says that this can only be used if this Pokemon is in the active and only on your first turn, but search your deck for a basic, except Ditto, discard this and put the Pokemon you searched in its place, then shuffle your deck. So it essentially gives you like a 5th copy of your good lead, I suppose, is the idea here, to increase your percentages of just starting with a good lead. So playing 5 Confe is not too bad. It's pretty dead in most other situations, though, so I think it's usually trumped by a Ball Search card in general in your deck. But it's kind of cool, at least, and the artwork is obviously fantastic. The evolutions, unfortunately, aren't anything to talk about. The Omastar, your opponent's active can't retreat when this is in the active, so again, more ways to just lock out the opponent, but really not that big a deal. The Kabutops applies weakness to be ×4 instead of ×2. We've seen this tons of times before, and it's never been all that good. The Aerodactyl definitely is interesting, though. It's a 130 hit point colorless type Pokemon that has the Degeneration Arc attack for 2 colorless. You deal 100, and if your opponent's active is an evolved Pokemon, devolve it by putting the higher stage evolution card on it into your opponent's hand. This also has a free retreat cost, which is naturally very good. I think this is definitely like a Zorobox card, right? There's going to be these higher hit point, difficult to deal with EX Pokemon, and suddenly you can just devolve and just deal with their little basic, and that's really good and really disruptive. So I think that's probably going to be a very solid card to the Zoro toolbox, I suppose. I don't think it solves many of the issues of Zorobox, but it becomes a big selling point, I suppose. We then have Snorlax. I've mentioned it a few times. I've referenced it already. It's a 150 hit point basic colorless type that has the Gluttony ability. allowing you to put 2 leftovers from the discard pile into your hand. So the idea will be to have 2 of these in play when you're using that Electrode and just spamming this to increase your hand size, which I suppose is kind of interesting. Its attack isn't anything to write home about. The legendary birds as well. Articuno's not great. Zapdos is kind of interesting though. It has a lightning attached, it has no retreats, and it has the multi-shot lightning attack for 3 lightning. You can deal 120. This also deals 90 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon that has damage counters on it. It's not great, but adding some sniping to the lightning deck definitely isn't too bad. You always have to think about, because you have Miraidon EX in the lightning style toolboxes, you can search Zapdos for the time where it's actually useful. Maybe using this with like Flaffies, and if you have like Escape Rope, or if you have Boss's Orders in hand, you can just Miraidon this out, make the play where you've already previously hit something, then suddenly you're finishing it off on the bench, whilst also dealing with something else in a turn. So I feel like this could be a tech one-of in Miraidon decks, just because you can tutor it for when it's a decent card, if you have access to Flaffies as well. So actually not too bad at all, I don't think. Obviously it requires some setup by pre-damaging stuff, which is why I'm mentioning things like Rope and Boss, because I imagine you're going to be like hitting something first, then finishing them off, rather than just being like Magnezone V-Star or whatever, where it just has a built-in easy snipe. I don't think that's going to be the case. I keep getting notifications because it's early in the morning, and I'm going to be in work very soon, so yeah. Alright, ignore all the stuff going down in the bottom corner. It's really not that relevant. I'm not reading it anyway. Dragonite, your Pokemon have no retreat cost, not worth it for a stage 2. Good for GLC though, I think. Maybe an upgrade. We have Mewtwo, great artwork, but again, they've done him dirty. No real useful text. If this Pokemon takes any damage, yeah, pointless. But we end on Mew EX, which is actually an interesting card. It's a 180 hit point EX Pokemon, a little bit squishy. It does have a retreat though, which is quite helpful. And it does have the ability Restart. Once during your turn, you may draw into have 3 cards in hand. So it's Instruct from Oranguru, one of my favourite cards in the Sun and Moon era, yes. Excellent effects, and it also has the Genome Hack attack for triple colorless. Choose one of your opponent's active Pokemon's attacks and use it as this attack as well. So could be some really interesting attack texts to copy. This is honestly just a very versatile card. What I will say is, obviously, Instructor Oranguru was just a single prize Pokemon, also didn't have a rule box, so can't be shot off by Path, and wasn't this 2 prize liability on the bench. So I think immediately you can't compare it to Guru. It's like a completely different card. Compare it more to things like Kricketune, which didn't see like any play. The upside, of course, is that Mew has an inbuilt free retreat, so it is definitely better than Kricketune, and its attack is useful. So this card will probably see play. It's just not like obvious exactly where, because we have to wait and see what sort of decks are in format. Path is still going to be super prevalent, so I think that's a bit of a downside. But giving certain archetypes some onboard Iono protection is at least quite handy. And again, it depends on what attacks are being played in the game. If it's going to be things like Chien-Pao, you definitely don't want an attack text like this. But if it's things like Arc and Tina V-Star and stuff, this is a really good basic that you could be having. So yeah, Mew very versatile, could certainly see some play, but I'm a little bit skeptical of it compared to Guru of the past. So yeah, overall, it's mostly been me saying that these cards aren't good enough, unfortunately, but I am interested in definitely the Blastoise, I think is really good. The Zapdos, the Aerodactyl are both really good. What else have we got? We have this like Electrode, fun, interesting deck with Snorlax. We have Weezing, which could go with Alakazam, but Alakazam could just be good on its own. What else are we looking at as the real threats? The Dodrio is kind of interesting. Honestly, for a like holiday set, this is not too bad. We're getting at least some interesting stuff. Venomoth kind of cool. The Wigglytuff is definitely the bait of the set, I'm pretty sure. Definitely looks more glamorous than it actually is. And I think the Charizard might be worth building around as well. There's always going to be some Charizard believers out there. So there you go, that's the 151. I definitely implore you to check out the set yourselves, because there's some awesome trainer gallery cards as well to look through. So going to be an awesome set to open, going to be a lot of fun. Like I said, this is going to be post-Worlds, so it's going to be starting off the 23-24 season. So we don't have to worry about these cards for Worlds, fortunately. We just have to worry about the current standard format. But yeah, hope you enjoyed my first impressions of this set Honestly, it doesn't feel great to be so down on these cards, but it is what it is. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.